The first sign that our quiet morning was about to turn into a full-blown HOA emergency didn't come with shouting or pounding on the door. It came while my wife was still brushing her teeth, toothpaste foaming at the corners of her mouth like she was preparing for a battle she didn't know had already started. I was half awake in the kitchen, pouring coffee, when her phone lit up with an emergency dispatch call meant for real crimes, not some HOA cult meltdown. She tapped speaker without even looking up, water still running in the sink. "Ma'am, we've received a 911 report that a woman named Rachel Merritt is unlawfully occupying a residence at Lake Pine Estates. The complainant is requesting immediate removal." Rachel stopped mid-motion, head turning slowly toward me, eyes wide, not afraid, just insulted in that cold way someone gets when their patience is officially gone. "Apparently," she said, spitting into the sink, "I'm illegally living in my own house." Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? That was the exact second the truth clicked with the soft violence of a trap snapping shut, because only one power-drunk clipboard parasite in this neighborhood was unhinged enough to weaponize 911 over her bruised ego. HOA President Karen, the self-appointed queen of Lake Pine Estates, a wannabe cop who strutted around acting like she owned every roof shingle in a 3-mile radius. She didn't just cross a line, she bulldozed straight through it. And the funniest part? She had no clue she just tried to evict the woman who runs the entire state police force. But that's not even the half of it. See, if you've never watched your calm, controlled, borderline legendary wife get falsely reported to 911 before breakfast, let me tell you, it hits differently. One minute you're stirring coffee, the next you're staring at the person you love while she wipes toothpaste off her face and mutters, "She really called the cops on me." But here's where everything blew apart. That moment wasn't random, it wasn't surprising, it wasn't even new. Because what happened at our kitchen sink that morning was just the explosion. The fuse had been quietly burning for 3 days straight. Lake Pine Estates didn't suddenly turn into a battleground. It had already been turned into one. Karen just finally decided to light the match and throw it into gasoline. And the part that still makes me laugh? She thought she was untouchable, that her fake enforcement and HOA intimidation would scare us into obedience. She thought a phone call would erase a homeowner. She thought a title made her powerful. She had no idea she'd just declared war on someone who could end her entire board with one documented report. She didn't know that the woman she was targeting didn't just enforce the law. She is the law. And while Karen paced around feeling victorious, measuring her imaginary power, she had no clue the ground beneath her was already cracking. Because once a wannabe overlord escalates from petty warnings to fake trespassing reports, there's no coming back. She crossed every line imaginable. And she was about to learn the hard way that when you weaponize authority against the wrong person, the fallout doesn't come loud. It comes cold. And this was only the beginning. 3 days earlier, before the 911 stunt, and before Karen decided to impersonate law enforcement with a clipboard, Rachel and I pulled into Lake Pine, expecting quiet, not warfare. We hadn't even unloaded the groceries when the crunch of gravel made us both look up, and a white Lexus slithered into our driveway like it owned the deed. The door opened, and out stepped the kind of HOA Karen you can smell before she speaks. Perfume thick enough to tranquilize wildlife, sunglasses the size of satellite dishes, and a knitted sweater in a color that practically screamed budget surplus arrogance. She didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't even acknowledge that she was walking onto someone else's property like she had keys to the universe. She marched straight past us and started circling our cabin, scribbling on her clipboard like she was conducting a crime scene audit on a house she'd never been inside. Rachel tried being polite because she still believed in humanity back then. "Hi there. Can we help you?" Karen didn't stop writing. Didn't slow down. Didn't even blink. We've had unauthorized activity on this parcel. Need to confirm your status. Are you renters? Rachel set the paper towels down and wiped her hands on her jeans, confusion shifting into irritation. No, we own this place. Karen finally looked up, squinting like she'd caught someone lying under oath. I don't recognize you. That was her entire personality in 4 words. I stepped beside Rachel. We were here last spring. My name's Dean. This is my wife, Rachel. Karen's eyebrows climbed her forehead like they were trying to escape her skull. I'm the HOA president, she announced in the tone of someone expecting us to kneel. We require formal occupancy notices through the community portal. Did you submit one? Let me tell you something about that portal. Calling it broken would have been a compliment. It was a digital fossil from the Jurassic era that crashed if you breathed too hard. The login button worked twice a year. The calendar displayed random dates from 2018. Half the pages were labeled draft copy 3 final. This was the system Karen worshipped like it was NASA mission control. Rachel smiled politely. We weren't informed that was required for owners. Karen clicked her pen like she was detonating a grenade. Regardless, I don't see your name on the ownership record. And that was the moment everything shifted. My LLC was listed on the deed, not Rachel's, because it made the tax situation cleaner. Not a secret, not a scandal, just paperwork. But to Karen, it was ammunition. Her lips curled into something between a smirk and a snarl. She pulled out a slip of paper printed in Comic Sans, like she was running a daycare, not a neighborhood. This is a warning. You must vacate until your residency can be verified. Rachel took the slip, glanced at it once, and handed it back like trash. No thanks. I don't take orders from you. Karen looked offended that the earth didn't crack open in her honor. From that second on, she declared war. And she didn't wait. The next morning, we woke up to find our yard had violated the natural debris limit, which apparently meant 3 pine cones fell overnight. Then came the note taped to the door, accusing Rachel of excessive porch occupancy, which was just her drinking coffee on the swing. The masterpiece arrived 2 days later. A formal complaint accusing Rachel of unauthorized cohabitation, taped to our mailbox with packing tape and sealed with what looked like a lipstick imprint. Rachel read it in a deadpan voice. The unidentified female on premises must depart within 48 hours or face removal via local enforcement. I burst out laughing. Rachel didn't. She won't stop, she said quietly. She's going to push until she feels powerful. And she was right, because Karen wasn't just inspecting. She wasn't documenting, she was hunting. And what none of us knew yet was that she was building toward something much darker than warnings and notes. She was preparing for the moment she'd try to erase Rachel from her own home. And that moment was coming fast. By the time the mailbox complaint showed up like a ransom note for sanity, Karen had already shifted from petty rule policing into full surveillance mode, the kind of obsession that turns a bored HOA president into a backyard stalker with a clipboard addiction. Every morning brought a new intimidation attempt, disguised as community enforcement, like she thought repetition would convert delusion into law. First came the violation notice claiming our yard failed the natural debris limit, which translated to 3 pine cones existing on Earth without her permission. Then, a bright yellow warning about excessive porch occupancy, which was just Rachel sitting on the swing with a mug. Apparently a crime now. None of it rattled Rachel, but every ignored attempt made Karen's smile tighten like a rubber band stretched too close to snapping. And Karen didn't ease up. She escalated with the confidence of someone who believed fake enforcement could rewrite reality. 2 days later, we found a new document taped to the mailbox, wrapped in packing tape like evidence in a crime lab. Rachel peeled it off and read it flatly. Unauthorized cohabitation must be terminated within 48 hours, or enforcement will be initiated. She didn't laugh this time. She just folded the paper once and said, "She's not trying to enforce rules. She's trying to remove me." That was the moment the tone shifted from irritation to cold awareness, because Karen didn't just want control. She wanted elimination. And every time Rachel refused to bow, Karen interpreted it as an act of rebellion against her imaginary authority, making her more desperate, more reckless, more convinced she needed to win whatever twisted battle she thought she was fighting. The intimidation didn't stay on paper. We started noticing her Lexus creeping down our street at slower speeds each day, not driving, but circling, watching, taking mental inventory of our existence like she was preparing for some kind of fake tactical operation. At night, motion lights flickered because someone kept stepping onto the edge of our property just long enough to trigger them and disappear. It wasn't curiosity. It was testing boundaries. It was the kind of behavior that says, "I want to see how close I can get before you break." Rachel didn't break. She got quieter, colder, more focused. "She's building a case," Rachel murmured one night, staring at the window instead of the TV. And she was right. When Karen realized fake infractions weren't scaring us, she switched tactics. The next morning, a formal complaint arrived. Not handwritten, but typed like a legal document from someone who didn't understand legal documents. It accused Rachel of falsifying residency, refusing mandatory inspections, and obstructing HOA enforcement. The language wasn't just dramatic, it was personal, like Karen had finally dropped the mask and written what she really believed. "She thinks I don't belong here," Rachel said softly. "She thinks she can erase me." That was the final shift. Karen wasn't enforcing rules. She wasn't protecting the neighborhood. She was trying to intimidate someone off their own property. And the worst part wasn't the accuracy of the accusations, it was how confident Karen was becoming. Fake authority turns dangerous when it stops feeling fake to the person holding it. And Karen was crossing that line fast, because the next move she made wasn't a warning or a complaint or a note taped to a door. The next move was something only someone completely unhinged would attempt, and she had no idea what was coming for her. The morning Karen finally detonated her delusion into a full 911 stunt. We weren't shocked. We were just done pretending she was harmless. When the patrol cars rolled up our dirt road, their blue lights flickered through the trees like confused fireflies. Not racing, just approaching slowly. The way officers do when they already suspect the call is nonsense but have to treat it like a felony anyway. I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee, watching them step out like they were responding to a report about a suspicious raccoon, not a supposedly dangerous intruder. One officer unfolded a notepad he clearly didn't trust. The other kept glancing between the house and his partner, like he was silently asking, "Are we sure we're even at the right place?" Rachel didn't wait for a knock. She opened the door herself and stood in the doorway with the kind of calm that makes people nervous. The kind that comes from someone who has seen real emergencies and knows this isn't one. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, voice steady enough to cut glass. "I understand you're here to remove me from my own cabin." The younger officer blinked like his brain had blue-screened. "Ma'am, we received a 911 report claiming a trespass in progress. The complainant identified you by name." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "And yet here I am in pajamas, making breakfast." The officer shifted, trying to find footing in a situation that had already collapsed beneath him. May we come in? Rachel stepped aside like she was hosting brunch instead of dealing with a fake eviction attempt. I stayed near the hallway, watching them try to reconcile the absurdity of the call with the reality in front of them. One scanned the room out of habit, his eyes landing on fishing rods by the door, groceries still on the counter, the half-sliced apple Rachel abandoned when the dispatch came in. Nothing remotely criminal, nothing remotely unusual, nothing remotely worthy of sirens. Then the younger officer flipped to a second page on his notepad, and that's when the humiliation began. The complainant stated that you refused to vacate when told you were not an authorized occupant. Rachel let out a slow breath, the kind that signaled irritation without disrespect. Officer, I am the co-owner of this property in every meaningful sense except for the paperwork technicality on the deed. The complainant stated that you refused to vacate when told you were not an authorized occupant. Rachel let out a slow breath, the kind that signaled irritation without disrespect. Officer, I am the co-owner of this property in every meaningful sense except for the paperwork technicality on the deed. My husband purchased the cabin under an LLC, but I live here, I pay for it, and I certainly didn't break in. The older officer nodded slowly, already understanding exactly what this was. An abuse of authority wrapped in HOA theatrics. Do you have proof of affiliation with the owner? He asked gently. Without hesitation, Rachel picked up her phone and opened files like she was presenting evidence in a courtroom she already knew she would win. Here's our Merritt, he said carefully. I just want to confirm your full name. Rachel Merritt. He swallowed. As in, Commander Merritt? Rachel gave a polite nod. The shift was instant. Both officers straightened so fast their spines probably realigned. The older one took off his hat. The younger one looked like he might evaporate. Commander, ma'am, he said, voice suddenly respectful and terrified at the same time. We were not informed. Rachel lifted a hand. Relax, you're just doing your job, but I want something on record. She grabbed the remote and tapped the security feed onto the TV. The footage appeared. Karen creeping around the cabin 2 days earlier, photographing our recycling bin like she was collecting evidence for a garbage-based sting operation. Then another clip. Karen stretching a measuring tape across our stack of firewood while mumbling to herself. And then another. Her stepping onto the porch uninvited, measuring the distance between the welcome mat and the door frame like she was mapping out a raid. The older officer exhaled. That's trespassing. And harassment, Rachel added, her tone flat and final. And if she called 911 claiming I was an intruder, that's misuse of emergency services. The younger officer didn't even try to hide it. That's exactly what she did. That was the moment everything shifted. Not for us, but for them. The officers realized they had been dragged into a circus by a woman playing dictator with a homeowners association. Commander, the older one said quietly, if you'd like to file charges. Not yet, Rachel interrupted, her voice calm enough to freeze the air. But I want a formal log of every call made to dispatch involving this residence from this point forward. Of course, he said instantly. They filled out the paperwork like they were signing peace treaties after a war they accidentally walked into. When they finally stepped off the porch, they apologized 3 separate times. The younger one even offered extra patrols, which Rachel declined without hesitation. I don't need protection, she said. I need documentation. I closed the door behind them and leaned back against it, heart still pounding from adrenaline that never became fear. Well, I said, that went better than expected. Rachel didn't smile. Not really. Just a small, humorless curve that meant the game had changed. Karen thinks this is a power struggle, she said. She doesn't understand she just put herself on a collision course with actual law. And she was right. Because the 911 stunt wasn't the climax. It wasn't even the worst of it. It was the beginning. And Karen had no idea how far she was about to fall. By the time the patrol cars disappeared down the road and the dust settled back into the gravel, Rachel wasn't rattled. She was calculating. Karen, on the other hand, thought she'd just staged a victory. The kind of pathetic delusion only a power-drunk HOA president could celebrate. But the thing about people like her is simple. When intimidation doesn't work, they don't stop. They get worse. The next morning started like nothing had happened. I was frying eggs. Rachel came back from her run, hair damp with lake mist, breathing steady like the world hadn't just tried to evict her. But the peace didn't last. At exactly 9:17 a.m., Karen's white Lexus slid past our cabin slower than the day before. Not a drive-by, surveillance. Not curiosity. Checking to see if Rachel had been hauled off in handcuffs like she imagined in whatever fantasy world she lived in. Rachel didn't flinch. "She's checking if the police did her dirty work," she said, wiping her face with a towel. "She really believed you'd be gone." "She hoped fear would do what her fake authority couldn't," Rachel replied, walking inside with the calm of someone sharpening knives in her mind. But Karen wasn't done circling. 2 hours later, the Lexus crawled past again, slower this time, like a predator testing the perimeter before lunging. She didn't honk, didn't wave, didn't blink, just stared through tinted glass like she was waiting for a collapse that wasn't coming. Rachel checked her phone and held the screen out to me. It was an email, subject line in all caps like a toddler screaming through a keyboard. "Unauthorized occupant remains on property. Urgent action required." Sent to the entire HOA board at 7:30 a.m. She'd been working before sunrise, spiraling before breakfast, drafting her own downfall in real time. The email was a masterpiece of delusion. Karen claimed Rachel had threatened her, refused mandatory inspections, and destabilized the community. She even attached a blurry screenshot of Rachel jogging past a pine tree with the word loitering slapped over it like a crime lab label. I burst out laughing. Rachel didn't. "She's serious," she said quietly, "and the more she loses control, the more dangerous she becomes." And she wasn't wrong. By noon, another email hit our inbox, this time from Greg, the HOA treasurer who treated spreadsheets like sacred scripture. It read like someone sweating through their keyboard. "The board will hold a special session this afternoon to review possible violations. Please bring documentation. No greeting, no signature. Pure bureaucratic panic." I asked Rachel if she wanted me to go with her. She shook her head. "No, this isn't a showdown, not yet. Let her dig." And that was when I realized something terrifying. Not about Karen, but about Rachel. She wasn't reacting. She was positioning. She wasn't angry. She was waiting. She wasn't intimidated. She was letting Karen climb. Because when someone builds their identity on power they don't actually have, they eventually step off the ledge themselves. And Karen was already standing on the edge. What none of us knew yet was how fast she was about to fall, and how hard the ground would hit when it finally arrived. The HOA clubhouse always looked harmless from the outside. A beige box pretending to be important. But that afternoon it felt like walking into a pressure cooker someone forgot to turn off. Rachel went inside alone while I stayed in the truck, watching through the windshield as neighbors slipped in with the kind of nervous energy people have when not in they know a storm is coming but hope it won't hit their house. Even from the parking lot I could hear Karen's voice leaking through the thin walls, shrill and shaking, not with fear, but entitlement. She refuses to comply with standards, she snapped, pacing like a zoo animal trapped in her own ego. She is not registered. We cannot allow instability. Instability, that word again. The one she clung to like it meant law instead of insecurity. Then a different voice, probably Greg, the treasurer who always sounded like he was apologizing for existing. There's no legal basis to remove her, Karen. She's married to the owner. Karen fired back instantly. She's unverified. We have rules. Then silence. Not a respectful silence, but the kind that happens right before someone drops a blade on the table. Rachel's voice cut through the room like a clean incision. If I may, she said, calm enough to freeze the air. Not only am I married to the deed owner, but I am also formally listed as co-executive under the LLC that holds the property. No shouting, no anger, just surgical fact. But she didn't stop there. And though I dislike bringing this up, I am also the head of our state's law enforcement division. The room went dead. Even the air held its breath. So, unless this HOA intends to escalate to a real courtroom, I suggest we stop pretending this is anything more than personal. You could have heard dust settle. Greg mumbled something about protocols like he wished he could evaporate. Karen, of course, doubled down because people like her don't know how to retreat, only how to dig deeper into their own grave. She is mocking our authority, Karen squawked, voice cracking. Rachel didn't raise hers. She didn't need to. Karen, she said sharper now, the only reason this hasn't gone legal is because I assumed you were capable of stopping before embarrassing yourself further, but you have continued to escalate. Another silence, longer, heavier, the kind that makes people stare at the floor because eye contact feels dangerous. Then footsteps. The door opened. Rachel walked back to the truck without a word, face unreadable, buckled her seatbelt like she was closing a case instead of leaving a meeting. How'd it go? I asked. She exhaled once through her nose. They're afraid of her, she said. Too afraid to vote, too afraid to stop her. They postponed the issue. Postponed. The ugliest word in HOA language. It never means pause. It means we'd rather let the problem grow than confront the person causing it. So, what does that mean? I asked. Rachel looked straight ahead, eyes cold and steady. It means Karen is going to get worse. And she did. Because postponement wasn't protection, it was gasoline, and Karen was about to strike the match. We didn't realize how fast worse would arrive until Saturday night, when the world went quiet in the way it does right before something breaks. Rachel and I had just come back from dinner in town, one of those rare, peaceful drives where the windows are cracked and the pine air feels clean instead of suffocating. The cabin looked exactly the way we left it, or at least that's what we thought. Rachel stepped onto the porch first, keys in hand, then stopped so abruptly I nearly walked into her. The front door wasn't open wide. It wasn't kicked in. It was cracked, just enough to say someone had been inside and wanted us to know it. Rachel didn't speak. She pushed the door with 2 fingers and stepped in like a soldier clearing a room she already knew was violated. Nothing was smashed. Nothing was missing. But everything was wrong. A framed photo of us was face down on the table. A kitchen drawer, the one where Rachel kept her off-duty badge, was pulled halfway open. A coat that had been hanging neatly by the door was now draped over a chair, like someone sat there and watched. It wasn't theft. It wasn't vandalism. It was a message. I felt my heartbeat in my throat. Rachel didn't tremble, didn't curse, didn't panic. She pulled out her phone and spoke in a tone I had never heard from her. Not angry, not loud, just controlled enough to freeze bone. Activate incident report, code red. Intrusion with civil escalation suspected. Secure location immediately. Her phone chirped an acknowledgement like we were standing in a command center instead of our kitchen. Then she turned to me, eyes cold as winter steel. She crossed the line. We didn't sleep that night. Every sound felt like footsteps. Every shadow felt like an answer we didn't want. But the next morning proved Karen wasn't finished. She was escalating into something darker than harassment. Into surveillance. Around 10 a.m., a buzzing noise filled the cabin. Faint at first. Then louder, like an angry insect made of metal. I pulled the curtain back and felt my stomach drop. A black drone hovered 6 feet from our second-floor window, camera blinking red, tilting as if recognizing my face. Rachel sat at the dining table, watching footage from the break-in with the calm of someone assembling evidence, not processing fear. "We've got a visitor," I said. She didn't look up. "She's documenting us." "No," Rachel replied, finally lifting her eyes. "She's baiting us." I stared at the drone. "Into what?" "An emotional reaction," Rachel said. "If she gets footage of me yelling or acting aggressively, she'll use it to justify another call." I swallowed hard. "She's that strategic?" "No," Rachel said. "She's desperate, and desperation mimics strategy." She forwarded the security footage to 3 different state agencies with the same casual efficiency most people use when forwarding memes. Then she made a phone call, a short, surgical one. "Yes, I'd like to initiate a formal investigation into unauthorized access and harassment by a private HOA member using restricted emergency credentials." That was the moment everything shifted. Because Karen wasn't just creeping. She wasn't just measuring firewood or taping complaints to mailboxes. She had used a master key, one that only HOA leadership was supposed to access, to enter our home. And Rachel had proof. "Time to lay a trap," she murmured, sliding her phone aside. "She wants escalation. Let's give her something she can't climb out of." I didn't know what she meant yet, but Karen was about to learn the difference between pretending to have power and colliding headfirst with someone who actually does, and the fall was going to be brutal. The morning after the drone hovered outside our window like a mechanical vulture, Rachel was already up before sunrise, sitting at the dining table surrounded by documents, coffee, and a silence so controlled it felt like strategy breathing. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't rattled. She was preparing, the way someone does when they already know exactly how the next move will play out. I barely got 2 steps into the room before she said without looking up, "She's escalating faster than I expected." "Which part?" I asked. "The break-in, the drone, the emails, the insurance report, all of it." She paused the footage on a frame where Karen's pastel sweater was unmistakable, even in grainy black and white. "Breaking into a state official's home tells me she thinks she's untouchable." Before I could respond, a car door slammed outside, sharp enough to slice through the morning stillness. I went to the window and pulled the curtain back, just as Karen began marching down our walkway like she owned the gravel under her shoes. And she wasn't alone. Behind her was a young man in a cheap suit, clutching an oversized briefcase like it was a flotation device, and he knew he was about to drown. Karen didn't knock gently. She pounded like she was serving a warrant instead of humiliating herself. Rachel stood, smoothed her shirt, and opened the door with the kind of quiet composure people mistake for weakness right before it becomes a weapon. Karen didn't wait for an invitation. She shoved her hand toward the trembling lawyer like she was presenting a trophy. "Tell her," she ordered. The young man cleared his throat with the confidence of a houseplant. "Ma'am, I'm Stephen, representing the HOA's legal advisory team. We've prepared a cease and desist order regarding your conduct and unauthorized presence within the HOA jurisdiction. If you refuse to comply..." Rachel lifted one hand. Not high, not threatening, just enough. Stephen froze mid-sentence. "Stephen," she said quietly, "let me stop you there." Even I stepped back. "First," she continued, voice steady as a locked door, "I have already filed complaints with multiple state agencies regarding Karen's behavior, including criminal trespass, unlawful surveillance, and misuse of emergency access keys." She nodded at the drone controller Stephen was awkwardly holding, like Karen had shoved it at him without warning. "Second, this property falls outside HOA enforcement due to its LLC structure and county classification. I verified that with records this morning." Stephen's face folded into panic. Karen's jaw clenched so hard I could hear her teeth grinding from the doorway. "And finally," Rachel said, stepping forward just enough to shift the air, "I am Commander Rachel Merritt, director of this state's law enforcement division. So unless you have a court order signed by a judge, what you're holding is just stationary with ambition." Stephen looked like he might evaporate. But Karen, because she is the human embodiment of doubling down, spat out the worst sentence she could have chosen. "Your position is irrelevant. You are a threat to community order." Rachel turned her head slightly, the way a storm shifts before it hits. "Authority comes from law, Karen," she said, voice dropping to something surgical. "Not from clipboards." The silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt like impact. Then Rachel held out her hand. "The drone controller." Karen blinked. "What?" "Now." Every molecule of color drained from Karen's face. Her hand shook as she slowly pulled the black controller from her purse and placed it into Rachel's palm. Rachel powered it off with a soft click, like closing a coffin. "Unauthorized surveillance device neutralized," she said. Stephen whispered, "Oh no," under his breath. Karen spun around so fast she looked mechanical, grabbed Stephen by the sleeve, and dragged him toward the Lexus without a single word. Gravel sprayed as they sped away like they were fleeing a crime scene, because they were. I closed the door slowly, pulse still pounding. "Was that legal?" I asked. Rachel sipped her coffee like she'd just finished reorganizing a pantry. "Legal enough," she said, "and satisfying." But the storm wasn't shrinking, it was gathering. And the next person to get involved wasn't an HOA board member. It was someone with the power to flip Karen's entire world upside down. We barely had time to breathe before the next escalation hit, because when someone like Karen gets publicly humiliated, they don't disappear. They detonate. That same evening, while Rachel washed dishes and I pretended to sort mail, her phone buzzed with the kind of caller ID that freezes the air. She dried her hands, glanced at the screen, and muttered, "Of course." It was Judge Halford, a man who didn't waste words and never called for anything small. Rachel answered. "Evening, Halford." His voice came through tight, irritated, like he was already done with whatever was sitting on his desk. "Rachel, are you sitting?" "I'm standing," she said. "Then brace yourself," he replied. "I just received an emergency injunction request asking for the removal of a potentially unstable, non-registered individual from a residential neighborhood." Rachel didn't blink. "Let me guess. It names me." "It names you," Halford confirmed. "Filed pro se by a woman named..." Papers shuffled. "Karen Pinebrook." Rachel closed her eyes for half a second. Not surprised, just disgusted. Halford exhaled, long and exhausted. "Rachel, it's absurd. A Frankenstein of misused legal terms, fabricated regulations, and rambling accusations. Reads like someone tried to write a courtroom thriller after one glass of wine and a concussion." "Will it move forward?" Rachel asked. "Absolutely not," Halford said. "I'm rejecting it immediately, But Rachel, she's not being petty anymore. She's going nuclear. Rachel thanked him and hung up without a word. She didn't rant, didn't pace. She just stood there staring out the window at the lake, perfectly still, like stillness itself was strategy. She's cornered, she said finally, and cornered people lash out. But what happened the next morning wasn't lashing out. It was detonation. At 7:02 a.m., 2 dark SUVs rolled up our road in silent formation. Not police, not local enforcement. State Ethics and Law Review Division. They don't show up unless someone has crossed from HOA nonsense into actual misconduct territory. 2 investigators stepped out, suits crisp enough to cut glass, eyes scanning the property with the kind of calm that means everything they do will be documented and permanent. The taller one approached. "Commander Merritt." Rachel stepped forward. "Yes." "We're initiating a formal inquiry into allegations of leadership abuse, false filings, and misuse of emergency protocols by a member of your HOA." He handed her a document the weight of consequence. "We'll need to interview you and your husband. A notice will be issued to the board today." My jaw almost hit the floor. Karen wanted escalation. She just invited the state. Rachel scanned the papers, nodded once. "We'll cooperate fully." The investigators didn't smile. They didn't need to. They left the way they arrived, silent, precise, and devastating. I turned to Rachel. "So, this is happening." Rachel didn't look shocked. She looked finished with restraint. "Yes," she said. "It is." By noon, our inbox was a graveyard of panic. 6 emails from board members who had suddenly discovered courage now that the consequences weren't theoretical. 3 apologized. 2 begged for clarification. 1 insisted they never supported Karen's actions, which was a lie so transparent it might as well have been printed on glass. Meanwhile, Karen sent a single email. "This is a misunderstanding. I will resolve it personally." Rachel read it and gave the coldest laugh I've ever heard. Not amused, just aware. "She still thinks this is about authority," she said. "She doesn't understand. It's out of her hands now." And she was right. Because by sunset, a formal suspension notice was taped to Karen's door. By nightfall, the board held an emergency session, without her. And for the first time since we arrived at Lake Pine, the air didn't feel hostile. Not peaceful, but clear. Like the entire forest had been waiting for someone to finally expose the rot. Rachel didn't celebrate. She just stood on the porch looking down the road into the dark. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "How can you tell?" I asked. She didn't look away. "Because people like Karen don't go quiet," Rachel said. "They only go silent right before they try something worse." And she was right again. Because the next phase wasn't louder. It was quieter, more calculated, more dangerous. Karen wasn't finished. She was just getting started in the dark. The silence that followed Karen's suspension wasn't relief. It was the kind of quiet that makes the hairs on your arms rise because something is still moving beneath it. For the first time since we arrived, her Lexus didn't crawl past the cabin. No emails hit the inbox before sunrise. No complaints appeared taped to anything. It didn't feel like peace. It felt like a breath being held. Rachel didn't relax. She watched that silence the way a surgeon watches a heartbeat monitor, aware that flatline doesn't mean safety. It means something else is coming. And she was right. 3 days later, a small brown package showed up on our porch with no return address, no postage, just placed there like a gift from someone who didn't care about being seen. Rachel didn't touch it. She pulled on gloves, carried it to the kitchen table, and opened it like she was defusing a bomb. Inside wasn't threatening. It was worse. A single item wrapped in tissue paper, a porcelain figurine of a woman standing alone at a doorway, face turned away, suitcase at her feet. No note, no explanation. Just symbolism sharp enough to be a blade. Rachel stared at it for a long time, expression unreadable. "She wants me to leave," she said softly. Not sad, not scared, just acknowledging the message for what it was. But the figurine wasn't the escalation. It was the opening move. That night an email arrived from an address we didn't recognize, no name attached. Some people don't belong where they force themselves to stay. Rachel read it once and deleted it without blinking. But the next morning made it clear Karen wasn't improvising. She was planning. A new HOA filing appeared in the county portal under a recently formed entity. Pinebrook Community Preservation Council. Same initials, same street, same woman behind it. Except now she used her maiden name, as if changing letters could erase accountability. Rachel sat at the table, scrolling through the documents with a stillness that felt like the air before lightning hits ground. "She's trying to rebuild," Rachel said. "She thinks if she creates a new organization she can start over before the consequences catch her." I leaned over her shoulder. "Can she do that?" Rachel didn't blink. "Not anymore." She pulled up state statutes faster than I could read them, cross-referencing licensing requirements, officer disclosures, and conflict of interest clauses with the precision of someone who lives inside legal structure instead of just using it. Then she found it. One line in a regulation almost no one on earth would have noticed. Individuals under active investigation are prohibited from forming new governing entities, pending review. "There it is," she murmured. She trapped herself. That should have been the breaking point. But Karen didn't crumble. People like her don't collapse when they lose power. They scramble for it. At 4:19 p.m., a final message came. Not angry, not threatening, just desperate enough to be chilling. "We can resolve this if you leave quietly." Rachel stared at the screen, then closed the laptop with the gentleness of someone shutting a coffin. "She still thinks she has leverage," she said. "She still thinks I'm negotiating." I swallowed. "So what happens now?" Rachel stood. The shift in her posture so subtle most people would have missed it, but I felt it like a temperature drop. "Now," she said, "we stop letting her write the narrative." And she meant it. Because the next move wasn't an argument. It wasn't an email. It wasn't a confrontation. It was something final, something irreversible, something that would shut every door Karen kept trying to pry open. And she had no idea it was already in motion. The next morning didn't arrive gently. It dropped like a gavel. Rachel was already awake before sunrise, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a stack of documents that looked less like paperwork and more like the blueprint for someone's downfall. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't emotional. She was executing. "It's time," she said quietly. And the way she said it made the air feel heavier. I didn't ask what she meant, because deep down I already knew. Karen had spent weeks weaponizing fake authority, and now Rachel was about to use real authority to end her entire reign in one move. She logged into the state administrative portal and began drafting something with the precision of a surgeon cutting exactly where it hurts most. A petition for statewide governance review and permanent authority suspension. Not a complaint, not a warning, a shutdown order. Within minutes, she attached every piece of evidence: security footage of Karen trespassing, screenshots of harassment, the drone controller serial number, the attempted injunction, the emails, the figurine, the new HOA filing under her maiden name. It was the kind of documentation no one could talk their way out of. Not even someone who believed clipboards were a form of law. When she hit submit, There was no dramatic music, no lightning outside, no explosion. Just a quiet confirmation message on the screen. The digital equivalent of a trapdoor opening under someone who never saw it coming. "How long will it take?" I asked. Rachel closed the laptop. "Not long. The evidence speaks for itself." And she was right. Because 4 hours later, a white envelope appeared in our mailbox. No return address, no stamp, just placed there by someone who didn't want to be seen delivering it. Rachel opened it with one smooth motion. Inside was a formal directive from the State Licensing Commission. Effective immediately, Karen Pinebrook was barred from holding any position in any governing body pending full review. No hearing first, no warning, just removal. Clean, cold, final. The kind of consequence that doesn't raise its voice because it doesn't have to. An hour later, the HOA group email thread detonated into chaos. One board member resigned on the spot. Another claimed they were deceived by Karen. Greg sent a message that looked like it was typed while sweating through a shirt. Effective immediately, Karen no longer represents this association. Please refrain from contacting her. But the only message that mattered was the one not sent. Karen didn't write anything. Not a word. Not even a period. Silence. Absolute, perfect silence. That evening, Rachel and I stood on the porch as the sun fell behind the pines. No cars slowed down. No notes appeared. No surveillance. No Karen. It should have felt like victory, but Rachel didn't smile. She just stared out at the dark road with the stillness of someone who understands that endings don't always announce themselves. They just arrive. "So that's it?" I asked quietly. Rachel didn't answer right away. Then she turned, eyes cold and certain. "Not yet," she said. "She's gone from power, but she hasn't felt the consequences." And she was right, because the next morning the final blow didn't come from Rachel. It came from the state. And when it landed, there was no screaming, no argument, no denial. Just the sound of a power trip dying without a fight. It happened just after 9 a.m., when the lake was still quiet enough to hear the wind move through the pines. A black sedan rolled down our road, not the kind that flashes lights or demands attention, just the kind that shows up when decisions have already been made and there's nothing left to discuss. 2 state compliance officers stepped out, crisp suits, no hesitation. The kind of people who don't knock unless they already know what's behind the door. They didn't come to us. They went straight to Karen's house. Rachel and I stood at the window, not hiding, just watching the truth finally clock in for work. No shouting came from inside. No dramatic meltdown. Just a long, heavy quiet that stretched through the entire neighborhood like everyone was holding the same breath at the same time. 10 minutes later, Karen stepped outside. No clipboard, no sunglasses, no smug posture like she owned every blade of grass in the subdivision. She looked smaller, not physically, but in that way someone does when the world finally stops pretending they're in charge. One officer handed her a packet thick enough to end a career, then pointed to a section she clearly didn't want to read. Her jaw twitched, her throat swallowed once. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. She just stood there while the officer explained something she could no longer outrun. That her suspension wasn't temporary, that her authority wasn't paused, that her power wasn't coming back. Not here, not anywhere in the state. When the officers left, she didn't storm back inside. She didn't look around for an audience. She just stood in her driveway staring at the paper like it had rewritten her entire identity in a single sentence. For someone who once acted like she could erase people with a sticky note and a threat, silence was the only sound left. That afternoon, the neighborhood shifted. People walked their dogs without looking over their shoulders. Vince waved at us from his porch, relief softening the lines in his face. Even the air felt different, like someone had finally opened a window in a room that had been sealed for too long. Rachel didn't celebrate. She didn't need to. She sat on the porch with her coffee, calm as stone, watching the world settle back into place. When I finally spoke, my voice felt small in the quiet. "So, it's finished?" Rachel didn't look away from the road. "No," she said softly. "It's settled." And that was the difference. Endings are loud. Consequences are quiet. The sun dropped behind the trees, the sky went dark, and for the first time since Karen tried to turn our home into her battleground, there was nothing left to fight. No threats, no noise, no footsteps on gravel. Just one truth settling over everything like the final closing of a door. Karen backed off our property without a single word. The strange thing about the days that followed wasn't the quiet. It was how quickly the neighborhood remembered how to breathe. No meetings, no threats taped to doors, no patrol car blue lights flickering through the trees before breakfast. Just ordinary life returning like it had been waiting behind a curtain the whole time. Rachel spent her mornings on the dock again, coffee in one hand, bare feet dangling over the water like the world had finally given her space to exist without being monitored by a clipboard parasite looking for reasons to feel important. People who used to avoid eye contact now waved first. Vince walked by without his shoulders curled up around his ears. Even Greg stopped flinching every time a notification hit his phone. The absence of Karen felt louder than her presence ever did. It was like someone pulled the plug on the neighborhood's anxiety, and the tension drained out slow and steady until the only thing left was stillness. But that's when I realized something most people never understand about surviving a power-drunk HOA. It doesn't just disappear when the villain does. It lingers in muscle memory. It hides in the silence. It waits for the next shoe to drop. And that morning, while the lake barely rippled and the world pretended everything was normal, Rachel picked up the final piece of paperwork the state had delivered the night before. She scanned it once, then folded it with the same calm precision she used when disarming someone without raising her voice. "It's done," she said. Not triumphant, not relieved, just certain. I asked her what that meant. She didn't answer with a speech. She didn't look up. She just slid the document into the file drawer, the one she'd refused to open unless she absolutely had to, and closed it with a soft, final click that felt heavier than any slammed door. The fight was over, but the weight wasn't. Not yet. And that's when I understood the truth Rachel had known long before the rest of us caught up. Some battles end loudly, but the real victories end in silence. The morning felt too normal, the kind of calm that makes your nerves suspicious after living under a clipboard dictatorship for too long. I was sitting at the kitchen table, steam rising off my coffee, when Rachel stepped out of her office with that same controlled stillness she always carried before delivering news that mattered. She didn't speak right away. She just held a single envelope in her hand, the kind that looked harmless until you remembered how many times a piece of paper had been used as a weapon in this neighborhood. She set it on the table between us. "This arrived late last night," she said. Her voice was calm, but the kind of calm that comes after months of refusing to be moved by anything or anyone. I slid the envelope open and pulled out a document stamped with the state seal. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a notice. It wasn't another attempt to push us into a corner. It was confirmation. Permanent prohibition from HOA leadership, community governance, or compliance authority statewide. No appeals pending. No reinstatement process. No loopholes. Karen was legally barred from ever holding power again, not just here, anywhere in the state. The system had finally done what it should have from the beginning. I looked up at Rachel, expecting relief, maybe even satisfaction, but she just exhaled quietly and leaned back in her chair. "People think justice feels like fireworks," she said. "Most of the time it feels like this." Stillness settled between us. Not heavy, not tense, just final. But before we could even finish our coffee, a shadow passed across the porch window. A soft, hesitant knock followed. Rachel stood, not bracing for a fight anymore, just prepared. When she opened the door, it wasn't Karen. It was Linda, the neighbor who once spent her afternoons policing bird feeders and measuring fence heights, like she was auditioning for neighborhood surveillance awards. But now she looked smaller, like someone who had finally realized there was never any power in fear, only loneliness. She clutched a folded piece of paper in both hands, knuckles pale. "I wanted to give you this," she said quietly. Rachel took it without flinching. Inside was a handwritten apology. Not dramatic, not pleading. Just honest. Linda admitted she'd gone along with Karen because it was easier than opposing her, that silence felt safer than confrontation, that fear made people obedient long before rules ever did. Rachel didn't shame her. She didn't lecture. She just nodded once and said, "Do better next time." Linda did something I never expected. She actually sighed in relief, like someone had lifted a weight she'd been pretending she didn't feel. When she left, Rachel closed the door gently, not like before when every knock felt like a threat disguised as paper. She turned to me. "This is what everyone forgets," she said. "When someone like Karen falls, the people who stood behind her don't disappear. They have to decide who they are without her." Outside, the lake stayed still. The neighborhood stayed quiet. But under that quiet was something new, something Karen never understood, something she could never control. People weren't afraid anymore. And that kind of silence is the one thing a wannabe tyrant can never survive. The day moved slowly, the kind of slow that feels earned, not fragile, like the world was finally returning to its natural rhythm instead of the manufactured chaos Karen had forced into every inch of the neighborhood. Rachel spent the afternoon reviewing new charter drafts with the quiet focus of someone who wasn't chasing power, just preventing it from landing in the wrong hands ever again. I watched her from the porch, the sunlight cutting across her profile, steady and unbothered in a way she hadn't been for months. It hit me then. Peace didn't look dramatic. It looked like ordinary life coming back without permission. But the universe has a way of testing you, right when you think the storm has passed. Around 4 p.m., a county vehicle rolled slowly down the road. Not police, not enforcement. Just a standard administrative sedan, plain and predictable. Yet after everything we'd lived through, even normal headlights brushing across our driveway made my muscles tense. The car stopped at the house 2 doors down. Vince's place. I stood without thinking, instincts wired from months of expecting the worst. Rachel joined me at the railing, her expression unreadable but alert. A county officer stepped out, clipboard in hand. Not the HOA kind, the real kind, the kind tied to actual authority. Vince came to the door looking pale but composed. They spoke quietly. Papers exchanged, signatures made. Then the officer shook Vince's hand before returning to the car. No tension, no escalation, no panic. Just a process doing what it was supposed to do. Correct, not destroy. When the vehicle pulled away, Vince stepped into the yard and looked towards us. Not scared, not hunted, just relieved. Rachel nodded once. He nodded back. No words needed. The world was functioning again. That should have been the end of the moment. But something else happened. Something small enough to miss, unless you understood the weight of it. A group of neighbors gathered at the end of the road, not to whisper, not to stare, not to fuel rumors, but to talk like normal human beings instead of frightened spectators in their own community. Someone laughed. Someone asked about weekend plans. Someone mentioned grilling. For the first time since we arrived at Lake Pine Estates, people weren't united by fear. They were united by normal life. And it felt almost unreal to witness. Rachel went back inside, but before she did, she paused at the doorway. "You notice that?" she asked. I nodded. "They're not avoiding each other anymore." Rachel's voice stayed low, but certain. "Fear makes people isolate. Safety brings them back." She disappeared into her office, leaving the door open, not because she needed backup, but because she didn't need to protect the house from the world anymore. The sun began to set, painting the lake in shades of gold instead of tension. And for the first time since Karen tried to turn our address into a battlefield, I didn't look over my shoulder when the wind shifted. The neighborhood wasn't holding its breath anymore. It was finally exhaling. But that's when I realized something important. The absence of danger doesn't erase the memory of it. It just gives you room to remember who you were before someone tried to take your peace and call it authority. Night settled over the lake with the kind of quiet that used to feel normal instead of suspicious. But habits built under harassment don't disappear just because the threat finally did. Rachel and I sat on the porch long after the sun dropped behind the ridge, letting the stillness wash over us like we were relearning how to exist without scanning every sound for danger. The crickets were loud again, not drowned out by anxiety or adrenaline, just doing what crickets do when people aren't spiraling into chaos. Rachel rested her mug against her knee, not tense, not guarded, just present. And for the first time since Karen tried to evict her from her own home, she actually looked like someone who could breathe without calculating her next move. But even in that calm, something shifted. A small sound on the gravel road, not rushed, not sneaking. Just footsteps moving slowly toward our house. I felt my stomach tighten out of old reflex, but Rachel didn't flinch. She just listened, the way someone does when they've spent their entire career separating threat from noise. A moment later, Greg appeared at the bottom of the steps, hands in his pockets, shoulders lower than they'd ever been. He didn't look like the treasurer of anything. He looked like a man finally facing the aftermath of everything he'd ignored. "Didn't mean to bother you," he said quietly. Rachel didn't invite him up, but she didn't shut him out either. She simply waited. Greg let out a breath like it hurt to release. "We finished the vote," he said. "The new charter passed." Rachel stayed silent. He continued, voice rough with honesty. "And I wanted to tell you something directly, not as a board member, as a neighbor." Rachel's eyes narrowed just slightly. Not suspicion, just precision. Greg swallowed. "We saw what she was doing long before it reached you. We told ourselves she was just strict, just thorough, just keeping order. But the truth is, we were afraid to stop her, and we let that fear turn into permission." The wind moved through the trees, soft but heavy, like the whole forest was listening. Rachel didn't rescue him from the discomfort. She let him feel it. Finally, he looked up. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if we deserve it. I just wanted you to know we're rebuilding the right way. Not because we got caught, but because we finally understand the cost of letting one person act like the rules only apply to everyone else." Rachel set her mug down with controlled precision. "Then don't repeat it," she said. "No softness, no comfort, just truth." Greg nodded, eyes wet but steady. "Thank you for not becoming what she accused you of," he said. "Most people would have burned the whole place down." Rachel's expression didn't change. "Power isn't the problem," she said. people who think it belongs to them are. Greg left without another word, footsteps fading into the dark, and the quiet that followed wasn't tense anymore. It was clean. Rachel leaned back against the railing, gaze on the water instead of the road. "This is how it ends," she murmured. Not with a fight, not with a victory lap, with accountability landing exactly where it should. The moon reflected across the lake like the world was finally right side up again, and for the first time since this nightmare started, nothing felt like a warning. It just felt final. The next morning unfolded with a kind of quiet that didn't feel borrowed or temporary anymore. The air wasn't holding its breath. The house wasn't waiting for the next intrusion. Even Rachel moved differently, not like someone bracing for the next attack, but like someone whose instincts finally had room to stand down without feeling exposed. She brewed coffee without checking the window first. I walked to the mailbox without scanning the tree line. Small things, but after months of living under a neighborhood stalker disguised as a president, small things felt like luxury. The mailbox creaked when I opened it, the same way it always had, except today my pulse didn't spike. Junk mail, a water bill, a local circular. Nothing wrapped in intimidation, nothing handwritten in rage, nothing pretending to be official. I almost closed the mailbox before I noticed it. A plain white envelope tucked flat against the back, unstamped but delivered intentionally. For a split second, my chest tightened with that old reflex, but when I turned it over, something was different. No shaky handwriting, no threats disguised as warnings, just a printed seal from the State Licensing Commission. I brought it inside and placed it on the counter. Rachel walked in, hair still damp from her morning run, calm in a way I hadn't seen since before Karen decided our lives were her playground. She opened the envelope without hesitation. One page, direct, final. It stated in clear language that Karen Pinebrook, under any variation of her legal name, was permanently barred from holding authority in any HOA, Neighborhood Governance Board, Compliance Committee, or residential enforcement capacity statewide. No review period, no reinstatement process, no appeal. Permanent. Rachel read it once, then folded the document with the same steady precision she used the day she shut down that drone controller. No celebration, no smile, just closure. "So that's it?" I said. Rachel shook her head slightly. "That's the paperwork," she replied. "The ending already happened." She slipped the document into a separate file. Not the evidence binder, not the incident folder, just a thin, quiet section labeled closure. Then she closed the drawer with a soft click that felt more final than any slammed door or shouted victory ever could. We stepped onto the porch with our coffee, not as a defensive habit, but because the morning actually felt like something worth stepping into. The lake didn't feel like a boundary anymore. It felt like part of our life again. A breeze moved across the water, carrying pine and sunlight instead of tension. Neighborhood kids rode bikes down the gravel road without glancing at porch windows. Someone's dog barked without triggering a complaint. Normal life had returned, not because someone demanded it, but because the person who tried to control everything finally had none. Rachel leaned against the railing, eyes on the water. "People think justice is loud," she said quietly, "but silence is what it sounds like when it actually works." And she was right. There was no gloating, no revenge tour, no final showdown. Just the simplest, coldest consequence imaginable. Karen existed in a world where she no longer had an audience, authority, or fear to feed on. The neighborhood didn't just move on, it healed. And the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was earned. That evening, the lake looked almost unreal in its stillness. The kind of glass-flat calm you only notice when your mind isn't busy preparing for the next strike. Rachel and I sat on the dock as the sun dropped behind the tree line, our legs dangling above the water, like we finally trusted the world not to shift underneath us. She wasn't scanning the shadows. I wasn't listening for gravel crunching under unwanted footsteps. The quiet wasn't a warning anymore. It was a return. But peace after a war always feels like a test. And mine came in the form of something so small I almost ignored it. My phone buzzed. An email notification, nothing dramatic. I glanced at the screen expecting spam, but the sender made my stomach tighten. Not because it was threatening, but because it was unexpected. It was from Vince. No panic in the subject line. No shaky sentences. Just 4 words. Thought you should see. I opened the attachment. A screenshot. A public filing log from the state's regulatory portal. Karen's name appeared once, then immediately again, marked withdrawn. Not rejected. Withdrawn. Rachel took the phone from my hand, scanned the image, then handed it back with a calmness I couldn't read. She tried again, I said quietly. Rachel shook her head. No. She thought about trying again. Then reality caught up before she could finish the paperwork. The wind moved across the lake, soft but deliberate, as if the world itself agreed. That was the moment I understood something Rachel had known all along. Power-hungry people don't stop because they learn. They stop because the consequences finally become bigger than their delusions. We sat there for a long time without speaking. The sky darkening into deep blue. The kind of blue that makes the water look endless. When Rachel finally did speak, her voice was steady enough to anchor the entire shoreline. She's not our problem anymore, she said. She's her own. A loon called across the lake, echoing into the kind of silence that feels earned instead of empty. Lights flicked on in neighboring cabins, not from fear, but from routine. Normal life had returned so completely that it almost felt strange remembering a time when every sound meant danger. Rachel leaned back on her palms, eyes on the reflection of the moon stretching across the water like a silver path leading nowhere and everywhere at the same time. You notice something? She asked. I waited. No one's watching us anymore. And she was right. Not a single curtain shifted. No binoculars glinted from a window. No headlights idled at the end of the road. For months, our home had been a stage for someone else's obsession. Now it was just ours again. The kind of peace that doesn't ask for attention. The kind that doesn't need an audience. The kind that arrives only after every line has finally been crossed, exposed, and buried. The air cooled as night settled in fully, and for the first time since this began, I didn't expect anything else to happen. No twist, no retaliation, no final desperate lunge. Just the quiet truth settling into place like the last piece of a puzzle Rachel had seen coming long before the rest of us. The war was over. And in the end, the only thing left standing was the silence. The next morning came without an alarm, without tension, without that instinctive jolt that used to hit the moment sunlight touched the windows. I woke up to the sound of Rachel frying eggs instead of pacing the hallway with her phone in hand, and for a moment I just lay there listening to the house exist, without stress holding it together like tape. When I stepped onto the porch, the air smelled like pine and cold water, not fear or anticipation or adrenaline. Rachel joined me a minute later, 2 mugs in hand, hair still damp from the shower, relaxed in a way I hadn't seen since before Karen tried to turn our address into her private battlefield. We didn't talk about what had happened. We didn't need to. The absence of chaos said everything. Around mid-morning, a delivery truck rumbled down the road. Not a police cruiser, not an inspector, not someone looking to weaponize paperwork. Just a standard parcel drop. The driver waved, casual and unbothered, and for the first time in a long time, I waved back without wondering if the box was going to contain another threat disguised as a notice. When I set the package on the table inside, Rachel glanced at it and smiled. Not cautiously, not suspiciously, just normally. "Open it," she said. I did. Inside wasn't another warning, complaint, or absurd attempt at intimidation. It was a welcome basket from the new charter committee. Local jam, candles, a handwritten note signed by 7 neighbors thanking Rachel for helping restore the community instead of taking it over. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't praise her like some hero returning from war. They were simple. "Thank you for protecting this neighborhood without becoming what you fought." Rachel read it once, then placed it gently on the counter like something fragile and earned. Before either of us could speak, there was a soft knock at the door. Not pounding, not demanding, just polite. Linda stood there again, this time holding a small binder instead of binoculars. "We're collecting signatures," she said, voice steady but humble. "Not for complaints, for support. We want to make sure the new charter passes unanimously." Rachel nodded, took the clipboard, and signed without hesitation. No speeches, no warnings. Just a single stroke of ink that marked the end of something toxic and the beginning of something that didn't need fear to function. When Linda walked away, the gravel didn't sound like footsteps from a threat. It sounded like a neighbor going home. Rachel closed the door and leaned against it, not out of exhaustion, but out of release. "It's strange," she said quietly, "how heavy silence feels when you're not used to it." I didn't interrupt. I just stood beside her while the house settled around us, the walls no longer holding tension like memory. Outside, the lake glittered under the late morning sun, and the world didn't feel like it was waiting for anything anymore. The nightmare hadn't ended with a dramatic finale or a final confrontation. It ended the way real power collapses. Not with noise, but with a life that no longer needs to notice you. The silence wasn't empty. It was earned. It happened on a day so calm it almost felt staged, the kind of quiet that makes you realize how loud your life used to be without you ever noticing. Rachel and I were sitting on the dock, coffee in hand, the lake flat enough to reflect the sky without a single ripple, when Greg walked toward us. Not rushed, not nervous, just carrying an envelope like someone delivering something final instead of asking for anything else. He stopped at the edge of the dock and held it out without stepping closer, like he understood that boundaries weren't symbolic here. They were earned. Rachel took the envelope, opened it, and read the document inside without a single change in her expression. It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't an update. It wasn't a request for help. It was the signed confirmation that the community charter had been officially filed, adopted, and locked. A system rebuilt so no one like Karen would ever rise again. Term limits set. Emergency access regulated. Surveillance forbidden. Abuse punishable by removal instead of rewarded with authority. Greg didn't apologize. He didn't explain. He just said, "It's done," because there was nothing left to say. Rachel nodded once, the closest thing to approval she ever gave, and Greg walked away, not looking back, not needing to. The air didn't feel tense anymore. It felt clean. We stayed on the dock until the sun shifted across the water. Not talking, not waiting, just existing in a world that no longer required vigilance to feel safe. And that's when I realized the war hadn't ended when Karen lost power. It ended when the neighborhood stopped giving it to her. Rachel set her empty mug beside her and glanced toward the road one last time. Not with suspicion, but with certainty, like someone checking the final page of a story she already knew the ending to. No cars, no watchers, no board members pretending to be important. Just a silent street and a community that finally remembered how to mind its own business. Rachel stood, brushed off her hands, and headed toward the cabin with the kind of calm that only comes from knowing the threat is gone, not hiding. I followed her up the steps, and when she closed the door behind us, it didn't sound like protection. It sounded like finality. Karen didn't come back. Karen didn't try again. Karen didn't send another letter, complaint, or shadow across our porch. She disappeared exactly the way every power-drunk bully does when the world stops bowing. HOA went dead silent.